Once this happens, the world changes for Bitcoin. Every single thing that everyone understands about Bitcoin changes after the ETF gets approved. What happened to gold after GLD was approved was that gold had 8 consecutive up years, right? 8 consecutive up years. And gold is an asset where I can manipulate the supply of gold pretty easily. Bitcoin is an asset where I cannot manipulate the supply very easily, cannot manipulate the supply at all. So therefore, Bitcoin, this is what happens. When an asset gets securitized, it will keep adjusting its price to the upside until we find a moment where capital can get saturated enough into the asset. But how do you reach a point of capital saturation when you cannot affect the supply of an asset? So then I think Bitcoin is going to go up much more than gold did. There's also more liquidity flowing around the system than there was in 2004. I also wonder what happens to Bitcoin's cycles. I think the cycles get affected because of the amount of capital coming in. Bitcoin typically in the last cycle that me and you both just went through, our first cycle, there was about $25 to $30 billion in net inflows into Bitcoin during that cycle. With an ETF, you're unlocking $200 to $300 billion of inflows. So Bitcoin, for the first time in its history, is going to face a demand shock, which it's never experienced before. It's experienced a supply shock, but it's never experienced a demand shock. So we now have a supply shock combined with a demand shock, combined with more liquidity coming into the markets, combined with the tightening cycle that we've been over the last 2 years coming to an end, the Federal Reserve getting to the point of lowering interest rates. A lot is lining up here for Bitcoin price appreciation, which is why I decided to get on YouTube and remind people, or at least alert people to the fact that Bitcoin is going to price you out from getting to 1 Bitcoin. And if you are sitting there with low single-digit millions of dollars of net worth, your time is running out, right? I think, up to $5 million will be priced out this cycle. If you've got a $5 million net worth, you won't be able to afford more than 1 Bitcoin after this next cycle. And then the next cycle after that, 2028 cycle, would price out somewhere between $5 and $12 million in net worth. And then it just goes to ultra high net worth by 2032.
Wow. It's crazy to think that. I mean, there's always these memes that float about, which goes like, there's something like 42 million millionaires around the world, and not everyone can acquire a Bitcoin. And now now they've got the vehicle potentially that would give them the comfort that will say, not only like the institutional rubber stamp, so to speak, say, hey, this is a legitimate asset class. And hey, by the way, it's the best performing asset out of 6 of the last 8 years. And you don't have to worry about all the custody and the headaches associated with that. It's got a great brand behind it. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. What are your thoughts in relation to kind of the self-custody versus the ETF in terms of different pricing? I've heard sort of thoughts around there is a possibility in the future, and maybe it's not in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, but sort of 20 years out, where there might be, Bitcoin is fungible, but it might be the case of, well, hey, the self-custody Bitcoin is more valuable than the ETF, because it's almost as if the money in the ETF could be a bit like Hotel California, in the sense of like, once your money's in there, it's not going to come out in the form of Bitcoin. You could get cash back, but you'll never be able to actually.
I think that's the wet dream of certain Bitcoin maxis, and I think that'll be completely irrelevant within probably the next US political administration, because whoever's going to come in next is going to realize that the market's been cleaned up by Gary Gensler, and we can now convert these from cash creates and cash redemptions to in-kind, in and out. So therefore, you will be able to take out Bitcoin from the ETFs, just like you can do with the GLD ETF. So yeah, I think that's, there's a lot of Bitcoin companies right now that are basically staring their maker in the face, because they're about to get completely destroyed. Their value is about to get completely destroyed because the institutions are now here. It's not like anyone warned them about this, right? But you got Bitcoin companies, right? Bitcoin only companies backed by bullshit venture capital companies that are basically looking for an exit return, not realizing that even though they're charging a 1% fee, Fidelity is going to charge 0.39% to hold your Bitcoin in the ETF. You don't have to worry about custody. You don't have to worry about anything. And they're facing their maker. I believe half of these Bitcoin only companies are going to go out of business by the next cycle, because their VCs.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you talking about exchanges, or are you talking about
anyone?
Yeah.
Anyone. Every single one of them. right? They're going to get screwed because if you own physical Bitcoin, you're now going to. So let me ask you a question, right? If you own physical Bitcoin versus you own the same amount of the ETF, and I say physical, you know what I mean by that,
Yeah.
right? Like self-custody Bitcoin versus the ETF. You own the same amount, $100,000 in each one. You say to me that you want to do some borrowing, right, against your Bitcoin. And I say, well, if you want to borrow against the self-custody Bitcoin, I'm going to charge you an interest rate of 14%. If you want to borrow against your ETF Bitcoin, I'm going to charge you 3%. Which one are you doing?
Well, I mean, that's an easy one. But why would they make the distinction though in the first place, in your
Because it's
mind?
very simple. I got so much less regulation to deal with. I got so much less risk to deal with. The ETF structures are already present. I can go and borrow against my QQQ or SPY holdings right now, instantly. So all of the rails are there. It becomes much more safer for the banks and the institutions to lend against the ETF. And that's just how the system has worked. So Bitcoin is going to be adopted into the system. This is the process of securitization, which is what I've been talking about. And then you've got Bitcoin companies right now funded by bullshit venture capital firms that are basically shitcoin companies that are running a negative burn rate on a yearly basis, hopefully waiting for somebody to be acquired so they can generate return for their investors. And now they've got an ETF that's basically undercutting their top line fee by 2/3, right? It's just these companies are going to be bought off for their customer lists. That's it. There's going to be so much destruction of value in Bitcoin venture capital in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years. There will also be a lot of creation of value because it will get concentrated, and that's really the key to if you're thinking about Bitcoin venture capital, it's looking at, okay, which companies are at threat as a result of the ETF. It's exchanges, because retail doesn't give a shit, right? Most of retail that holds most of the capital in their hands don't care about self-custody, right? Because they've never had to self-custody any of their assets. So they're extremely comfortable holding US ETFs because of the regulatory environment around it. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's what it is. You've then got, so then you go, okay, what's the other market? Well, the other market is we can do institutional purchasing. Well, okay, but as you pointed out, 70% of the ETF applications are holding their Bitcoin and buying their Bitcoin through Coinbase. So Coinbase has already won the institutional. So if you're a company and you're a small business that makes, I don't know, let's say you make 20 million a year and you want to buy your Bitcoin, are you going to go to the number one institutional Bitcoin provider in the market, or are you going to go to some new upstart? What are you going to do? You're going to go to Coinbase, right? So all of these, there's a lot of shift that's coming here, and also, there's also tier one and tier two solutions to owning their Bitcoin. Right now, a lot of institutional capital has gone into companies like the Bitcoin mining companies, MSTR, and all these other options as an alternative to holding Bitcoin because they didn't want to go through the self-custody process. What happens to those? Right? Those are basically tier two solutions acting like tier one solutions. Tier one solution is the ETF or the self-custody Bitcoin. That's it. Tier two solutions are now the companies that add 3 or 4 layers of risk to holding that underlying Bitcoin. So what happens to those? I think there's going to be value destruction in those, and it's going to be interesting to see how this changes. Anyone who tells you that the Bitcoin ETF is a small part of how the market structure works over the next 3 to 5 years is a mental midget. They don't understand how damaging this is going to be to certain things that have formed the basis of the Bitcoin space, so to say, over the last 3 to 5 years.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think what you're really referring to here is that the weight of capital doesn't care about Bitcoin maximism, doesn't care about Bitcoin principles. And when you think about, and this is something that I heard in a recent podcast, where most of the wealth is held by boomers. Boomers are not going to be the ones lining up to try and buy from the Coinbases or the Swans or any of the Bitcoin only exchanges. They've got these familiar channels. They've got brokers. They can literally pick up the phone, or if they're doing everything online themselves, they can literally just pull the trigger on one of their brokerage accounts. So, and that's the weight of capital. So it feels in some ways, whether or not Bitcoin maxis like it or not, at least the sort of cultural, ideological types, it's evolving and it's going to evolve. And there will be aspects of the culture that are going to fundamentally change forever. And the idea of, you know, sort of the whole world being orange pilled, you know, in the sense of embracing all of the values that Bitcoiners embrace, low time preference and all that thing, I don't necessarily see that as being the case.